speaking to amendment number 28, is that correct? Yes. These amendments are about ensuring that applications are processed in a timely manner. The current wording is that the Chief Deciding Officer will assess an application as soon as practicable. That's completely unacceptable. The amendments in mine and other deputies' names insists that this be replaced with 28 days. These amendments are necessary because survivors and campaigners do not trust the process you're proposing. And why should they? Why for 1 second should they trust anything that comes from this government and from this state? Their lives have been shaped by abuse, human rights violations and suffering. They endured in these institutions. A state-funded church-run system denied them some of the most basic dignities, both in the homes and then for the rest of their lives. For decades, the church and state have conspired to oppress survivors, deny their rights, and make them fight tooth and nail for any progress. We're talking about some of the worst crimes imaginable. I feel like I've said these words so many times in this Dáil chamber. Forced family separation, incarceration, illegal adoptions, forced labour, illegal medical trials, denial of your dignity, and physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, all systematically targeted at the most vulnerable in society. When the state and church couldn't deny their stories anymore, they moved to denying justice, then hollow apologies, and finally, in the last act, dividing survivors and giving the bare minimum to some. I say the last act because that's what this is. Time has already run out for so many survivors, and others are too exhausted for another fight. There are thousands of survivors watching this right now, seeing another government ignore them, belittle their suffering, and try to brush over injustices. I know they're watching because they told me so. They're tuning in because they know that this is the last chance for any changes to this legislation. All they can do now is watch and see how we are representing their stories, their calls for basic recognition. Minister, can you truthfully say you are doing all that you can? Can you really say you've listened to survivors because your redress scheme says in black and white that you have not? You're ignoring the very consultation that you commissioned. Survivors and their allies gave their time and energies to make suggestions on an inclusive and meaningful scheme, and you disregarded most of them. This is why they don't trust you now. In the Oak report, the survivors made very clear recommendations which you have ignored, as will each TD who votes for this deeply insulting and harmful scheme. Survivors asked for a universal, inclusive scheme where all mothers and babies should be eligible for redress, regardless of the duration or year of their stay. You have ignored this and excluded those who spent less than 6 months in homes as children. The report calls for survivors who were subjected to coercive family separation outside institutions or who were illegally adopted, fostered, boarded out to be eligible. These malpractices are rightly among the list of abuses and human rights violations that must be recognised by this scheme. You ignored this and are excluding those who were illegally adopted and boarded out. The report clearly states that those who were subject of vaccine trials and milk formula trials should receive reparation. You ignored this. You excluded this as a category for redress. Moreover, you are doing nothing to pursue the pharmaceutical companies who perpetuated these crimes. The Oak report states that the most commonly held view in relation to financial recognition was that an immediate, interim, ex gratia common experience payment should be paid as urgently as possible. You ignored this and are making survivors wait for your scheme and go through a bureaucratic process with no guarantee of a timely result. This isn't my opinion, this is fact. Survivors know what they said. The report is publicly available. The glaring gaps between a meaningful and an inclusive scheme and your divisive and insulting proposal are clear for all to see. Not only is this what survivors want, but the UN, Rights Committee and Special Rapporteurs have called for the inclusion of all survivors. The removal of the legal waiver and redress for victims of racial discrimination. Again, you have ignored these calls. Finally, you have ignored the Irish people. You have disregarded the thousands of emails received by your constituents and mine. This scheme is being carried out in the name of the Irish people, and they know that it's wholly inadequate. They've repeatedly asked for a more inclusive and comprehensive scheme. The other call from ordinary people is to hold the perpetrators to account. Religious orders and pharmaceutical companies financially benefited from these horrific legal acts. Assets should be seized as part of criminal investigations. Instead, you're in negotiations with these bodies, kindly requesting a contribution. This isn't some charitable donation, this is justice. There is no valid reason not to recognise all survivors. People who spent any time in a mother and baby home deserve reparation. I know that, you know that, we all know that. Despite your callous and completely inaccurate description of the first months of life, they matter. They are incredibly significant. Survivors have suffered long trauma because of forced family separation, the breaking of that bond between parent and child. Today, this minister, this government, and every single Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Green Party backbencher, a few independent TDs who quietly support them, will vote to exclude 40% of survivors. You will put on the record of Dáil Éireann that the survivors of illegal adoption, forced labour, illegal medical trials, forced family separation and sexual and emotional abuse deserve nothing. That will be your legacy when the history books of mother and baby homes are updated to cover this shameful scheme and those who support it. Actually, really warmly welcome everybody up in the gallery this evening, and to extend the same warm welcome to anybody who's watching at home. But I think if I was watching on and I wasn't a member of this House, I would find what's happening confusing. So I just want to explain to people the reason why we're talking about very technical amendments at this stage in the bill, and if maybe you hadn't watched all of our previous debates, why that is. I think it's important to say that we're only permitted to make minor changes to the legislation at this late stage in it. So for anyone watching, that's down to the rules of the Dáil, and only the government can make decisions that actually result in the additional spending of public money. So any amendments that we would have put forward in relation to including, for example, people who spent less than 6 months in an institution, those amendments would have been ruled out of order before we got to this late stage in the debate. So it just might seem a bit confusing if you're watching on to think, why aren't we talking about those important issues? We would absolutely love to be, and we have previously, but in this exact moment, it's just not possible. In this case, it's the standing orders that are failing people in that sense. But obviously the government does have the power to change those things, and it's not actually too late. This is their last chance.
Thank you, Cancor, and I would like to support.
Thanks, Cahirlock, and I have to say that I find Amendment 56 from the Minister to be particularly, it's a bit rich, and I think it's distasteful, and I think it's representative of this entire situation. So it can be directly contrasted with amendments from myself and others which sought to ensure that applications are processed in a timely manner. So the Minister insists that the deciding officer and the staff administering the scheme are permitted to be given a kind of open-ended timeframe to process applications. But then for survivors making applications, they're requested to provide clarifications or evidence, and they're limited to 60 days. So just to recap, the officials are permitted to non-defined as soon as kind of practicable timeframes, whereas the applicants are given time limits, after which, if for whatever reason they can't reach, their application is going to be deemed to be withdrawn. I think that this disparity just reveals the entire mindset of the government and the department, a mindset that survivors are aware of anyway, but it really paints it in black and white, I think, for everybody to see. So fundamental and acute power asymmetry with a cruel state has defined survivors' lives. Young women were incarcerated for being pregnant. That is the only reason that they were stigmatised and locked away. Babies were taken away from their mothers. Children were in essence sold or subjected to illegal medical experimentation. And at the root of that was a twisted partnership between the church and state that sought to control and abuse women and children. The very least that this scheme could do for those you deem worthy of redress is to allow them the dignity of applying in their own time, and if they need to take a little longer, that you might accommodate that. The scheme should be about including everybody, about helping people apply, about going at the pace of the people who've endured horrific abuse and lifelong stigma. Unfortunately, it is the exact opposite. And you spoke there briefly about the birth information and tracing legislation and how 2,000 people have received their information. Well, 6,000 people have applied, so that leaves 4,000 without it who've applied, not to mention all the people who it might not have reached yet, who might not be aware of it. I think just because this is one of the last groupings in terms of the amendments that we can speak to, I want to say this, Minister, that this scheme is very blatantly arbitrary, and you will know that an arbitrary scheme is an unconstitutional one. You can't just randomly exclude people who spent less than 6 months in an institution. You can't ignore racial abuse in institutions. You can't ignore many things. And UN human rights experts, as well as survivors, very many people have told you about that. And I think this entire story has been one of underestimation. So in the first instance, I think it's safe to say that you underestimated the suffering that people have experienced. I don't believe you knew the extent of it or the amount of it. Then I think you underestimated the strength of feeling from the general public in relation to this. And finally, and I think most importantly, I think you underestimated the strength of survivors. And I've had the privilege of meeting many people who went through these horrible institutions in the last 3 years since taking up office. And I have to say that I've rarely been so motivated or inspired by the strength of individuals and groups. I think it's quite incredible. And I think you underestimate them at your peril, because I think that when you produce a blatantly arbitrary piece of legislation like that, you will regret it, because cases will be taken against it. And at this late stage, at this kind of final hour, I think that's all we can say. Change it now, or you'll see, why you should have.
Deputy Kathleen Funchion.
I'm the only person who's feeling the absence of Deputy Connolly tonight, and I'm glad that Deputy Pringle read something out on her behalf. But I think just to really acknowledge the amazing work that she's done in relation to this, and I know the people watching at home will be wondering where she is this evening, but like Deputy Pringle said, she couldn't be here, she's unwell, and yeah, just to pay tribute to all of her work. Thank you, Chair.
Deputy Funchion, Gone Ahmed.